History rarely remembers the quiet places, but in the shadows of Europe's great powers, a handful of restless men once looked south and saw a kingdom for the taking. They came not as kings, but as mercenaries, not with grand armies, but with swords for hire, loyalty for sale, and an appetite for risk that bordered on madness. From the cold fjords of Scandinavia to the warm, contested shores of the Mediterranean, they carried with them the unshakable belief that the world belonged to those bold enough to seize it. This is the saga of the Normans in southern Italy and Sicily, a story of war and diplomacy, of betrayal and unlikely alliances, of cultures clashing and then blending into something the world had never seen before. It's a tale of men who began as outcasts and ended as kings, carving their names into history with steel and stone. And trust me, once you step into this world, you won't want to leave. So before we set sail into this epic, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll never miss the next chapter in our journey through the forgotten corners of the past. Now, tighten your grip on the oars, because our voyage begins where the northern seas meet the ambitions of men who would one day rule the sunlit heart of the south. Origins of the Vikings. The north was not kind. It was a land of iron seas and skies the color of wet slate, where the wind screamed across jagged coastlines and winter ruled more months than it yielded. In this place, the sun was a guest, not a master, and life bent beneath the weight of cold and hunger. Yet from these hard coasts and harsher hearts came a people who would one day shake the bones of kingdoms. They were not born in cities. They were born where mountains bled into fjords, where pine forests whispered old gods' names, and where the soil grudgingly gave enough grain to keep a family alive, if the family was lucky and the year was merciful. The men and women of this place grew tall on fish, milk, and stubborn will, their muscles carved by the oars and their minds sharpened by the knowledge that tomorrow's meal might come only if they took it. And take they did. When the first longships slipped into foreign rivers in the late 8th century, they were not so much an army as they were a storm made of men. Their prows were carved into dragons and serpents, not as decoration, but as warnings, omens that the strangers arriving from the sea were not bound by the laws of the land. They were bound only by the promise of silver, honor, and the songs that would carry their names after death. They had many names to those who feared them, Northmen, Danes, heathens, but to themselves they were simply folk, farmers, fishers, and craftsmen, who when the ice melted became sailors, raiders, and merchants. They believed their lives were strands woven by the Norns, and if the weaving called for glory, they would meet it with an axe in hand. By the 9th century, the Viking tide was not a handful of raids, but a season. Like winter, they came predictably and with inevitability. In the east, they rowed their shallow-hulled ships down the great rivers of Rus, trading furs and amber for silver in the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate. In the west, they struck monasteries along the British coast, their attacks as sudden as they were brutal, church bells ringing not for prayer, but for alarm. It was in this age, in the year 860, that a boy named Hrolfr was born in the cold mists of Scandinavia. Later generations would call him Rollo. He was not yet the giant of the sagas, but he was already too big for his homeland, literally, so large that some ships could not hold him without capsizing, so restless that no single fjord could contain him. Rollo grew into manhood in an era when the sea was not a barrier, but a road, and he took to it as if it were an inheritance. By the final decades of the 9th century, Viking ambition had grown sharper, their raids no longer content with sacks of loot and burnt halls. They sought footholds, permanent stones in foreign soil from which to launch new ventures. In the rich river valleys of Francia, where wheat fields swayed like gold under the sun, they saw more than wealth. They saw a future. But the Franks had grown weary of the Northmen's fire. They learned to build walls, to muster knights, and to answer blood with blood. Rollo, already a seasoned sea king, carved his name into this dance of attack and reprisal. His fleets swept up the Seine, burning and plundering as Paris trembled. He fought not as a wolf who kills for hunger alone, but as a wolf who knows the valley and intends to claim it. By the year 911, both predator and prey were exhausted. Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, faced a truth he could not ignore. For every Viking killed, another ship appeared on the horizon. Rollo faced a truth of his own. For every village burned, another levy of Frankish spearmen rose to meet him. And so, on the banks of the Epte River, war gave way to negotiation. What was offered that day was more than a truce. It was an exchange of worlds. Charles granted Rollo a swath of land along the Seine, a place rich in soil and trade routes, in return for the Viking sword arm against other raiders. Rollo would bend the knee, though sagas whisper that he would not kiss the king's foot, and in return, he would be baptized into the Christian faith, tying his fate to that of his new land. Thus was born the Duchy of Normandy, its very name a scar of the Northmen who claimed it. But this was no surrender. It was transformation. The men who had once measured wealth in silver arm rings and plundered chalices now learned the worth of parchment charters, of vassal oaths, of the feudal game. They spoke the tongue of the Franks, wore their mail, rode their horses, but they kept the restless marrow of the sea in their bones. Over the decades, Normandy became a crucible. Viking blood mixed with Frankish custom, producing a people who were neither wholly Norse nor wholly French. They had the daring of the raider and the discipline of the knight, the long memory of the clan and the cold ambition of the courtier. They understood that the sword could take a throne, but the law could hold it. And yet, even as they built stone keeps and tilled their fields, the old hunger did not die. Normandy was fertile, yes, but it was small. Families grew, ambitions swelled, and the inheritance of younger sons shrank to nothing. The same winds that had once carried their fathers over gray seas now whispered of richer lands to the south, lands fractured, lands ripe. Italy, in the age to come, the descendants of those frost-born raiders would trade the mist of the fjords for the sun of the Mediterranean. They would bring with them the lessons learned in blood and bargain, forging a realm that would blend Latin, Greek, and Arab into something the world had never seen. But all of it, the battles, the crowns, the kingdoms, would be rooted in the long, dark winters of the north, where survival itself had been the first conquest. The Vikings had learned long ago that the world belonged to those willing to take it. Normandy was only their first proof. The next would be written not in the cold spray of the North Sea, but in the warm tides of the southern shores. Yet even the sharpest blade grows restless in its scabbard. For the Normans, the crowded fields and tight borders of their duchy became too small for their ambition, and so their lances turned once more toward distant horizons. The warrior culture of Normandy. Normandy was forged in the image of its founders, sharp-edged, restless, and unwilling to yield. The land itself was a crucible. Green valleys stitched with rivers, walled towns rising from the mist, and the cold channel tides gnawing at its shores. To the south lay the feudal heartlands of France. To the north, the memory of the sea and the old gods. In this place, the Norse became something new. Rollo's sons and grandsons wore wool cloaks instead of seal hides, prayed before the crucifix rather than the hammer of Thor, but in their marrow, the Viking remained. Their fields might yield wheat, but their greatest harvest was still glory. And glory, in Normandy, was bought not in the marketplace, but on the point of a lance. From boyhood, a Norman noble's life was a campaign in miniature. The sons of dukes and counts were raised not in the soft halls of luxury, but in the yards where hooves struck dirt and blunted swords rang against shields. A child's first lessons were not in letters, but in balance. How to stay mounted at full gallop, how to keep a spear steady while the world blurred past. By the time a boy could read the Psalms, He had already read the language of the battlefield in the sweat of horses and the clash of iron. Their armor was the skin of their identity, long hauberks of riveted mail, close-fitting iron helms with nasal guards, kite-shaped shields painted with the colors of their house. They fought as heavy cavalry, a style the Norse had once scorned, but the Franks had perfected. The Norman knight was a storm bound in steel, disciplined, devastating, and terrifying in the charge. Their destriers, bred for strength over speed, hit with the force of a battering ram. The shock alone could break a line of infantry before the sword ever fell. But Normandy was not an endless plain of enemies to conquer. It was a small duchy, and the warrior class was many. This abundance of armed men created a pressure, like steam trapped beneath a sealed lid. With land finite and titles jealously guarded, a younger son's inheritance was often nothing but a horse, a sword, and the hunger to use them. And so, within the duchy, a strange paradox thrived. A society that prized unity in war but accepted, even encouraged, rivalry in peace. Feuds flared between minor lords over strips of pasture or rights to a river crossing. Castles were besieged in miniature wars that lasted weeks, sometimes days. This constant low burn of conflict was not ruinous. It was sharpening. A Norman noble was never long without an enemy to test his mettle against, and in that crucible, skill became second nature. Violence was not a breakdown of the Norman order. It was the heart of it. To the ducal court in Rouen, the feud was a forge. It kept the iron hot. Those who survived these petty wars learned two lessons: how to win when the odds were even, and how to bow, for now, when they were not. Both would serve them well beyond the Channel. Honor bound them, but it was an honor as pragmatic as it was proud. A Norman lord would swear loyalty to his duke, fight for his banner, and die in his service, so long as the duke's fortunes matched his own. Fealty was a coin to be spent and re-earned. Betrayal was not a sin in itself, but a miscalculation if it failed. In the game of land and sword, the Normans understood the only unforgivable crime was to lose. If the sword was their right hand, the charter was their left. The Old Norse had ruled by might alone, but their descendants in Normandy learned the power of ink and seal. They knew a treaty could be as binding as chains, and far harder to break. Castles were taken with siege towers, yes, but also with marriage contracts, debt claims, and calculated oaths that lasted just long enough to serve their purpose. The Norman warrior was no brute berserker, raging blind into the shield wall. He was a gambler, a strategist, a courtier who could ride from the lists to the great hall and speak with equal fluency in the dialect of knights and the language of law. War itself became almost ritualized. There were the musterings, the heralds, the formal declarations, and then the raw, choking thunder of the charge. 100 knights shoulder to shoulder, lances leveled, hooves striking like war drums. The air would split with the sound of their advance, and the ground itself seemed to shrink away from their coming. When they hit, it was not like water eroding a stone. It was like a hammer striking glass. Yet even this display was as much about spectacle as slaughter. A Norman victory was the message, to allies, to rivals, to any watching world, that here rode a people who could not be moved by fear or pity. When they paraded through a captured town, banners streaming, armor bright in the sun, it was both celebration and warning. But there was always the question, what next? Victory at home could only feed the appetite for so long. Too many swords, too few thrones. Normandy itself could not contain them. Some sought fortune in service abroad, as mercenaries in Flanders, guards in Byzantium, or adventurers in the Holy Land. Others looked south, toward the patchwork of feuding princes and foreign powers that was the Italian peninsula. Italy called to them not only with the promise of land, but with something more intoxicating, the chance to be the architects of their own dominion, not merely the servants of another man's crown. Here, in the sunlit lands of the south, the old Viking restlessness and the new Norman discipline could unite in a single purpose. For now, the duchy thrummed with the rhythm of its warrior culture. The training yards, the hunting parties that were as much exercises in coordination as sport, the feasts where alliances were toasted with wine and sealed with handshakes still scented faintly of the day's campaign. This was a land where the sword was never far from the table, and every man of standing lived with one ear tuned to the sound of a distant horn. Normandy had been born of conquest and tempered in ceaseless contention. It had forged men who could adapt as easily to the saddle as to the council chamber, who could strike like lightning but endure like stone. And in the decades to come, that restless armored breed would spill out of their green duchy like a tide that would carry them to the shores of Sicily, the gates of Constantinople, and the halls of kings. The age of the Norman knight was coming, and the world would learn, as so many foes already had, that when they rode, it was not merely an army advancing, it was history itself, thundering forward. Yet even as they paraded their victories through the streets of Normandy, the question lingered in every hall and training yard. Where would all these sharpened blades be turned next? The answer lay far beyond the green valleys of the duchy, in the sunlit, fractured lands of the south, where ambition could find a wider stage. The southward migration. By the middle of the 11th century, Normandy was a forge at full heat, and a forge without enough space for all the blades it produced. The duchy's fields yielded grain, its markets bustled, its castles stood firm. Yet beneath the surface, pressure built. The noble class bred more warriors than the land could reward. Primogeniture, the inheritance of the eldest son, kept estates intact, but for the younger brothers it was a slow exile. They were born into knightly training, raised to fight, but handed nothing to rule. A sword and a restless heart were their only inheritance. This was not a generation that could be content with serving another man's banner forever. Viking blood still stirred in their veins, whispering of coasts unseen and fortunes unclaimed. Their Frankish discipline had taught them patience, but patience is only a prelude to motion. Beyond Normandy's southern horizon lay a land fragmented and rich, where a bold man might carve out more than a living. He might carve out a lordship. Italy. To a Norman eye, Italy was a patchwork of opportunity. The Lombard principalities of Benevento, Capua, and Salerno eyed one another with suspicion. The Byzantines clung to Apulia and Calabria, struggling to hold their western outposts. Muslim Sicily flourished under competing emirs, their rivalries as dangerous as any foreign enemy. And the papacy, wrapped in its spiritual authority, played a dangerous game of politics with all sides. The peninsula was no fortress. It was a chessboard, and no one player held the whole board. The first Normans did not descend in conquering hosts. They slipped in along the currents of pilgrimage. In the early decades of the 11th century, bands of Norman knights escorted pilgrims on the long and hazardous road to Rome, crossing the Alps or sailing down the western coast. Italian lords quickly saw the value in these mailed foreigners. They fought with discipline, struck with the fury of their northern ancestors, and, most important of all, they were for hire. Mercenary work became their doorway south. Lombard princes employed them to raid Byzantine towns. The Byzantines, in turn, hired them to punish rebellious Lombards. Even the Pope, when pressed by enemies, found Norman swords a useful shield. These were not sentimental alliances. Coin was the only oath that mattered, but each contract left the Normans wiser. They learned the routes, the terrain, the rivalries. They learned where the walls were strong and where they were crumbling. Some names began to stand out. William Iron Arm, whose spear had unhorsed Byzantine cataphracts. Drogo, his brother, who held captured towns with a grip like a steel trap. And Robert Guiscard, a younger son with the cunning of a fox and the patience of a siege. They were still captains for hire, but their ambitions were shifting. Land was worth more than silver. A garrison was worth more than a purse. By the 1030s, Norman companies had moved from temporary camps to permanent holdings. In Apulia, they claimed hill towns and fortified them in the Norman style, their stone towers glaring down at the sun-baked plains. Local peasants worked their fields. Local merchants paid their tolls. Mercenaries had become lords. Yet the south itself was only half the prize. Across the narrow Strait of Messina lay Sicily, fertile, wealthy, and divided among quarreling Muslim emirs. Whoever held Sicily would command the heart of the Mediterranean, controlling trade between east and west. To a Norman mind, it was the southern equivalent of their old Scandinavian seas, a theater of opportunity. The migration quickened. More younger sons left Normandy's crowded halls, taking the roads south through Burgundy and the Alpine passes, or boarding ships at Rouen and Cherbourg bound for Italian ports. They arrived with armor still smelling of the northern rain, but their thoughts already burned with the heat of the southern sun. Some came alone, others with brothers, cousins, or sworn companions. All came with the same conviction. The South was not just a place to fight, it was a place to rule. By mid-century, the Norman presence in southern Italy was no longer a curiosity. It was a force. They held lands in their own right, played local powers against each other, and drew yet more warriors from home. Their blend of Viking ferocity, Frankish discipline, and feudal ambition had found the perfect proving ground. The tide had turned. What began as a trickle of knights guarding pilgrims had become a steady flow of conquerors in waiting. Soon, the contracts would end, and the wars would be their own. Victory in the south no longer belonged to the lords who had hired Norman swords. It belonged to the Normans themselves. And with each fortress taken, each oath sworn and broken, they stepped out of the shadows of service and into the blinding light of ambition. Alliances and betrayals. Southern Italy was never ruled by one man's hand. It was a place of shifting sands, and in shifting sands, even the surest step could sink. The Normans arrived knowing how to fight. What they learned quickly was how to play a game far older and far subtler than war, the game of alliances. In the hill town of Melfi, the first chords of this new song were struck. Melfi sat at a crossroads, a Lombard stronghold, but coveted by the Byzantines who still clung to the coasts of Apulia. In 1041, a coalition was born there. Lombard princes weary of Byzantine taxes, and a cluster of Norman captains hungry for more than coin. William Iron Arm stood among them, his presence as direct and unyielding as the spear he carried. Beside him, his brothers Drogo and Humphrey, each a study in contrasts. Drogo cautious, Humphrey quick to anger. The deal was simple, at least on the surface. The Lombards needed steel that could stand against Byzantine discipline. The Normans needed legitimacy, a foothold recognized by local powers. They swore oaths, clasped hands, and set their sights on the fortresses that dotted the plains. At first, the partnership blazed with success. In the spring campaigns, Byzantine garrisons fell like fruit from an overripe tree. The Normans advanced with a speed the Byzantines could not match, their mailed horses thundering across fields where no cataphract dared charge. Each captured town swelled the Norman presence, each victory a seed of suspicion in Lombard minds. Because in every victory, the Normans claimed not just plunder, they claimed the walls, the gates, the keys. By summer's end, the alliance was strained. Lombard lords who had welcomed their northern allies now whispered that the cure was worse than the disease. The Normans were not leaving. They reinforced captured fortresses with their own men, rebuilt walls in their own style, demanded tribute from markets that had once paid to Lombard coffers. To a Norman, it was simply good strategy. To a Lombard, it looked like theft. The Byzantines, masters of intrigue, saw their chance. Envoys arrived with honeyed words and heavy purses, offering Norman captains land and gold to turn on their Lombard allies. Some were tempted. The Byzantines could be generous when fear gnawed at their borders. But the brothers from Hauteville had learned another lesson in their years in the south. Betrayal was not a game you played half-heartedly. If you turned, you had to make it decisive. So the Normans turned, but not against the Lombards. Instead, they redoubled their attacks on Byzantine positions, making it clear that no bribe could buy them away from their current path. The message was not loyalty so much as dominance. We are not yours to command. We command ourselves. It was in this crucible of shifting loyalties that the Norman reputation hardened. They became known not just as fierce in battle, but as dangerous in council. Men whose promises held only so long as they served their interest, yet whose vengeance was swift if crossed. Princes and bishops alike began to measure their words carefully when Norman ears were near. By the winter of 1042, the balance had shifted irreversibly. The Lombards, unable to dislodge their allies without courting disaster, agreed to formalize Norman holdings in Apulia. William Iron Arm was granted Melfi as his seat, not as a garrison commander for a Lombard prince, but as a lord in his own right. The ink on the charter was barely dry before Norman masons began reshaping the fortress, thickening the walls, raising towers in the stark northern style. It was a statement carved in stone. This was no temporary camp. But the same winter saw the first open breach within the alliance. A Lombard count, nursing resentment and convinced the Normans were plotting to seize his lands next, rode to Bari to swear fealty to the Byzantines. His defection sparked a chain reaction. Border raids, assassinations, shifting loyalties. The game had changed again, and this time the Normans were not content to be mere players. They began to see themselves as the board. From this point forward, alliance in southern Italy meant something different. It meant today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. It meant a feast could end with a dagger under the table. It meant that treaties were worth less than the steel you could bring to enforce them. The Normans understood this instinctively. In Normandy, they had learned how to fight. In Italy, they learned how to rule, and how to do it in a land where trust was as rare as peace. For the Lombards, the Byzantines, and every other claimant to the southern lands, a new reality was settling in. The Normans were no longer guests, no longer mercenaries. They were power, unpredictable, ambitious, and anchored now in stone. And power, once rooted, is hard to pull out without blood. It was only a matter of time before the alliances of convenience gave way to open wars of possession. And when that day came, the Normans would not be on anyone's payroll. They would be the ones writing the contracts, in their own terms. The alliances that had once defined the Normans' place in the south were already fraying, but with every bargain struck and every fortress seized, they discovered a sharper truth. In Italy, a sword was worth more than an oath, and land was worth more than gold. The costly mercenaries, southern Italy in the early 11th century was a chessboard no single player could control. The Lombards held pockets of inland power, fractured into quarreling principalities. The Byzantines clung to the coasts and cities of Apulia and Calabria, their governors enforcing imperial will with tax collectors and disciplined garrisons. Muslim Sicily lay just across the narrow strait of Messina, while the Pope in distant Rome sought to influence events with spiritual authority, and, when necessary, soldiers. It was a land where gold bought loyalty, but loyalty was a coin that often changed hands. Into this fractured world strode the Normans, not as conquerors yet, but as swords for hire. Their reputation after the battles of 1017 to 1018, even in defeat at Cannae, had spread through the courts of the south. Lombard princes, impressed by their ferocity, and Byzantine strategoi, grudgingly admiring their adaptability, both began to see the value of these strangers from the north. A Norman company might turn the tide of a campaign, and for a price they could be yours. The Normans learned quickly that in Italy, War was not only fought with spears and shields, it was fought with contracts. They could pledge themselves to a Lombard count one season, taking his coin to raid a rival's fortress, and by the next spring be marching under the banner of that same rival, now paying them double. It was not treachery by their standards. It was business. Normandy, their homeland, had taught them to fight for land. Italy was teaching them to fight for advantage. In the 1020s, their services were in constant demand. For the Lombards, Norman cavalry was the perfect counter to Byzantine cataphracts. Heavily armored, aggressive, and unafraid to charge uphill into fortified lines, they brought a raw, unorthodox energy that confused their more regimented enemies. For the Byzantines, the Normans were shock troops, an unpredictable hammer to smash through stubborn Lombard defenses. The Pope himself, when threatened by rebellious nobles or Saracen raids from the south, was not above hiring a few Norman companies to remind his foes that Heaven's shepherd carried a very sharp staff. The deals were struck in smoky halls and wind-swept tents, over tables scattered with maps and goblets of wine. A Norman captain's word was binding, for as long as the contract lasted. When the pay ended, so did the obligation, and when a new bidder came with deeper coffers, the Normans might ride in the opposite direction without a second thought. This two-handed game became their signature. One season they rescued a Lombard prince from a Byzantine siege, cutting through imperial lines with reckless courage. The next, they escorted a Byzantine convoy through territory patrolled by that same prince, smiling beneath their helmets as the Lombard watched helplessly from the hills. Both sides fumed, but both kept hiring them, because the alternative was to face them as enemies, and that was a cost neither side wished to pay. Yet the Normans were not content to live forever from the purse of others. Even in these early years, they sought something more permanent than silver, a base of their own. Every fortress they saw, every walled town they defended, was weighed in their minds as a possible home. But they needed an opening, a piece of land they could hold without answering to a foreign master. That opportunity came in 1029. The small fortress town of Aversa, north of Naples, had been a prize in the constant struggles between the Duchy of Naples, the Lombards of Capua, and the Byzantine sphere of influence. In that year, Duke Sergius IV of Naples found himself in desperate straits. Driven from his city by a rival faction, he fled to the Normans, who had recently served him as mercenaries in a coastal campaign. Sergius needed muscle to retake Naples. The Normans agreed, but not without naming their price. They fought for Sergius with characteristic ferocity, forcing his enemies to yield and restoring him to his ducal seat. In gratitude, and in recognition that he could not afford to alienate them, Sergius granted the Normans the town of Aversa and the surrounding lands. It was a bold, perhaps reckless move. No foreign group had been given such a concession in living memory. But Sergius calculated that a Norman buffer between Naples and the Lombards of Capua might work to his advantage. For the Normans, it was the turning point. Aversa was not a temporary camp or a garrison loaned from another power. It was theirs. They fortified it, expanded its walls, and brought in more men from the north to swell its ranks. What had been a mercenary band now had a permanent seat, and from that seat they could negotiate with princes and bishops as equals, not hirelings. The years that followed saw the first stirrings of dynasties. Among the Norman leaders in Italy, one family began to stand out: the Hautevilles. William Ironarm, his brothers Drogo and Humphrey, and eventually the younger Robert Guiscard, would all carve their legends from the stone of southern fortresses and the blood of its battlefields. They had come south as younger sons with no inheritance. Now, they were lords in their own right. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it without resistance. The Lombards eyed Aversa warily, aware that Norman friendship had a tendency to end the moment it was no longer profitable. The Byzantines considered the grant a dangerous precedent, a foothold for northern wolves in their pasture. Even the Pope, who had used Norman swords to settle his own disputes, began to wonder what would happen when those swords no longer needed his coin. But by the close of the 1030s, the Normans had secured their place. They still fought as mercenaries. For the right price, they could be seen under Lombard banners or marching in Byzantine ranks. Yet Aversa gave them a center of gravity, a place from which to expand, recruit, and plan campaigns on their own terms. Every coin they earned was now an investment in Norman power, not someone else's. Southern Italy was learning a hard truth. A Norman sword might be costly to hire, but once given land, it could not be bought back. Aversa was only the beginning. The alliances they once balanced with coin and caution had given them entry into the game, but Aversa gave them something far more dangerous: a place to stand, and from that place, the will to reach further. Establishing a permanent foothold. When the Normans first marched into Aversa, it was a modest stronghold, more outpost than citadel. The walls were serviceable but thin in places, the watchtowers squat and weathered from years of neglect. Around it lay farmland pocked with abandoned villas, the soil rich but underworked. Yet to Norman eyes, this was not a backwater. It was a seed, and they meant to water it with coin, sweat, and, if necessary, blood. The first weeks were not celebrated with feasts or banners. They were spent working. Stones were hauled to reinforce the curtain walls. Timber from the surrounding hills was cut and shaped into palisades. The old gatehouse was rebuilt, its drawbridge repaired so that it could be raised in moments at the sight of dust on the horizon. The townsfolk, Lombards and a few Greek-speaking settlers, watched with a mixture of awe and unease as the newcomers set about transforming their home. The Normans worked with the urgency of men who knew they had been handed a prize that others would soon try to take. From Aversa, they began to send for their kin. Messengers rode north across the mountains, carrying letters sealed with crude wax impressions. Land, pay, and plunder await in Italy. Younger sons from Normandy, restless knights without fiefs, and hardened retainers from Brittany and Maine followed the call. They came by ship into Naples harbor or overland through the passes, their armor dented from old campaigns, their eyes bright with the thought of a new life. With every arrival, Aversa swelled, not just in numbers, but in confidence. It was here that the Hauteville name began to gather weight. The family's origins were humble, their father Tancred a minor lord of Cotentin, with little more than a hall and a handful of men. But his sons, William Ironarm, Drogo, Humphrey, and the youngest, Robert, later called Guiscard, were cut from harder iron than their inheritance could hold. William arrived first, answering the call of fellow Normans already in the south. His leadership was instinctive. He spoke little, listened much, and when battle came, led from the front with a ferocity that made his sobriquet more than earned. Drogo followed, tall and sharp-tongued, with a soldier's practicality. Humphrey came after, quieter but steady, the kind of man who held a line when others faltered. And though Robert Guiscard was still years from making his mark, the shadow of his ambition already stretched toward Italy. The Normans knew they could not simply sit behind Aversa's walls and hope to endure. A fortress was a symbol, but symbols required proof. So they rode out, not as mercenaries under another's banner, but as the lords of their own domain. Raiding parties struck at bandit camps that had long plagued the countryside. Patrols rode the roads to Naples, ensuring that merchants could pass unmolested, and ensuring that they paid a small regular protection fee to their new guardians. Grain stores were rebuilt, wells deepened, and the surrounding farmland parceled out to Norman knights, who in turn swore to defend the land and provide men for future campaigns. In these years, the Lombards of Capua watched with growing unease. Aversa had been intended as a buffer between themselves and Naples, not as a rival power. Yet the Normans were consolidating with a speed the Lombards could not match. They trained relentlessly, their cavalry drilling in the open fields until their charges struck with a force like the breaking of a storm. Their discipline was different from the Byzantines' rigid formations, more fluid, more savage, the product of minds that saw warfare as both art and opportunity. Still, the Normans understood the need for alliances. They hosted Lombard envoys in Aversa's newly refurbished hall, offering wine and seats near the fire, speaking of mutual defense against Byzantine encroachment. To the Duke of Naples, they were courteous and deferential, a reminder that his grant had not been forgotten, even as Aversa grew more independent with each passing month. To the Pope, they sent word of their loyalty to Christendom, hinting that their swords could be wielded against the Saracens in Sicily if the Holy Father so willed. But beneath the polished surface, their eyes were always on the horizon. Every rumor of Byzantine weakness in Apulia, every report of Lombards squabbling in the interior, was noted and discussed. Aversa had given them a base. Now they needed a springboard. Small campaigns tested their reach. William Iron Arm led sorties into neighboring territories, sometimes under the guise of supporting an ally, other times as preventive strikes against threats that might one day menace Aversa. These expeditions served two purposes. They enriched the Normans with loot and ransoms, and they kept their warriors sharp. A Norman knight idle too long was a dangerous thing, prone to quarrels and duels. Better to turn that energy outward. By the late 1030s, Aversa was no longer a gift in Norman hands. It was a fortress bristling with spears, a gathering point for every ambitious northerner who had heard the whispers of opportunity in Italy. Merchants found it safer to trade under Norman protection, and their markets bustled with goods from the Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian. The clang of forges rang through the streets as armorers repaired mail and shaped swords. Even the churches reflected the change, their walls adorned with both Latin crosses and carved motifs that hinted at northern craftsmanship. The transformation was not lost on their rivals. Byzantine officials in Bari muttered that the wolf had been let into the fold. Lombard lords debated whether to ally with the Normans or to strike before it was too late. But the moment to dislodge them had passed. Aversa's walls were high, its knights seasoned, its coffers swelling. Any siege would be costly, any battle uncertain. In their hearts, the Normans knew the truth. They were no longer mere mercenaries. They were lords in a land where power was measured not by the title you claimed, but by the ground you could hold and defend. Aversa had taught them that permanence was possible, and permanence bred ambition. Soon they would look beyond their modest domain to the rich, contested lands of Apulia and Calabria. There the Byzantines clung to power, but not for long. The foothold had been secured. The climb to dominance was about to begin. Aversa had been the proving ground. Now, with their fortress secure and their ambitions sharpened, the Normans were ready to test their strength against greater prizes, and their eyes turned east, toward the glittering lands of Apulia and Calabria. Apulia and Calabria. From the ramparts of Aversa, the Normans could almost taste Apulia. To the east lay a land of rolling hills and sun-baked plains, dotted with walled towns whose Byzantine governors still spoke the language of Constantinople. The cities glittered with mosaics and golden icons, but beneath the splendor, cracks were spreading. Imperial control in Italy was no longer the iron chain it had been in the days of Basil II. In Apulia, loyalty to the emperor had to be bought, and the currency was running short. For the Normans, it was an irresistible scent. The smell of a fortress left half unguarded, of a strong-room door left on its latch. By the early 1040s, the Hauteville brothers and their allies in Aversa had built their reputation beyond mercenaries. They were now seen as a force unto themselves, a third pillar in southern politics alongside the Lombards and Byzantines. The moment came in 1041, when rebellion flared in Lombard-held Melfi against Byzantine authority. The Lombards, bold but underarmed, sent word to the Normans. They needed swords, they promised spoils, and, perhaps more importantly, they promised opportunity. The Normans answered. They crossed into Apulia not as hirelings, but as partners in revolt. Under William Iron Arm's command, a mixed force of Norman cavalry and Lombard infantry began striking at Byzantine garrisons. The Normans brought speed and shock, their lances breaking enemy lines before the Lombards closed in to finish the work. Town after town fell, their imperial banners ripped from the walls and replaced with the standards of the rebels. The Byzantines, alarmed, dispatched a seasoned commander to crush the uprising. But the Normans knew the imperial style of war now. They had fought both alongside and against it for years. They baited the Byzantines into open battle near the river Ofanto, forcing them onto ground better suited for cavalry than cataphracts. When the charge came, it was a thunderclap. Norman horses slamming into the Byzantine flank, shields shattering, the front ranks breaking before the weight of impact. It was not just a victory, it was a declaration. The success emboldened them to push farther south. Calabria beckoned. A narrow, mountainous finger of land reaching toward Sicily, its coastline dotted with ports and fortresses that could control the straits. The Byzantines still held it, but their hold was tenuous. Their troops stretched thin between too many garrisons. For the Normans, Calabria was more than a conquest. It was a dagger aimed at Sicily itself. The campaigns there were brutal. The land was less forgiving than Apulia. Narrow passes, treacherous ravines, and hilltop strongholds that seemed to grow out of the rock itself. Siege became the order of the day, with the Normans using both force and cunning to pry open the gates. In some towns, they stormed the walls under a hail of arrows. In others, they negotiated surrender, promising leniency that was sometimes kept and sometimes forgotten when the spoils were counted. By 1047, the victories in Apulia and Calabria had transformed the Norman position from that of opportunistic raiders into recognized rulers. That year, Emperor Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire, wary of their growing power, but seeing value in their hostility toward Byzantium, formally invested them with the county of Melfi. The Pope, too, recognized their claim, preferring Norman rule to continued Byzantine dominance. It was a masterstroke of legitimacy. The Normans were now not just conquerors. They were counts, holding land with the blessing of both emperor and pope. Their enemies could no longer dismiss them as foreign interlopers. They were a political reality. Melfi became their new capital, a hilltop fortress from which they could oversee both Apulia and the approaches to Calabria. The Hautevilles fortified its walls, stocked its armories, and turned it into a hub for administration and war planning. From here, campaigns were mapped out against the remaining Byzantine holdings, raids were launched deep into Calabria, and plans began to form for the most audacious move yet, the crossing into Muslim-held Sicily. Yet for all the grandeur of their victories, the Norman advance was not without cost. Apulia and Calabria were not empty lands waiting to be claimed. Resistance flared in the countryside, often from local lords who saw the Normans as little better than the imperial tax collectors they had replaced. Rebellions had to be crushed, sometimes with brutal reprisals that stained the Norman name as much as their swords. Even among their Lombard allies, there was unease. The partnership that had begun in rebellion was starting to look more like a takeover. But the Normans did not measure themselves by popularity. They measured themselves by what they could hold, and hold they did. By the decade's end, the Byzantines in southern Italy had been pushed to the brink. Their strongholds in Apulia fell one by one, their garrisons either slain, ransomed, or absorbed into Norman service. In Calabria, their authority had shrunk to a few coastal enclaves, more reliant on sea supply from Constantinople than on any loyalty from the land. From the walls of Melfi, William Iron Arm could look south and see the glittering line of the horizon where Calabria met the sea, and beyond it, the faint shadow of Sicily. It was close enough to feel like destiny. The Normans had come from the cold seas of the north, carved a place for themselves in the sunlit fields of Italy, and now their gaze was fixed on the island that had been Muslim for a century and a half. The campaigns in Apulia and Calabria had given them more than territory. They had given them the confidence of conquerors, the legitimacy of recognized rule, and the strategic position to strike at the greatest prize in the south. The Byzantines, once their employers, were now a broken presence. The Lombards, once their partners, were now their subordinates. The Pope, once their client, was now their uneasy ally. In less than a generation, the Normans had moved from selling their swords to wielding them for their own empire, and Sicily, rich, divided, and shimmering in the sun, would be next. Yet as the Normans tightened their grip on Apulia and Calabria, their rising power cast a long shadow, one that reached all the way to Rome, where the Pope began to see not allies but rivals. Clash with the Pope. By the early 1050s, the Normans had grown too powerful for comfort, and nowhere was that discomfort felt more keenly than in Rome. What had begun as a convenient alliance had become a looming problem. The Pope had once welcomed Norman swords to defend Christendom from Saracens and to keep the Byzantines in check. But now those same swords were carving out lands for their own lords, imposing their own taxes, and enforcing their own laws. To the papal curia, the Normans were not guardians of order. They were wolves in the fold. Pope Leo IX, a reformer of deep conviction, believed no prince or baron should rise beyond the reach of the church. In the south, the Normans were doing exactly that. Reports poured in of their raids, their heavy levies, their disregard for episcopal authority. And so, in 1053, Leo decided to act, not with sermons, but with soldiers. He formed an army unlike any Rome had fielded in years, a coalition of Swabian heavy infantry from the Rhineland, papal levies from the central Italian towns, and allied Lombard contingents. Word was sent to the Byzantine governor of Bari, urging imperial support against their mutual threat. Even from the north, messengers rode to Emperor Henry III, who looked on with wary interest at the chance to check the Norman tide. The Pope's intention was clear: to march south, break the Norman power in a single decisive battle, and bring their leaders to heel. If not to execution, then to a state of humble obedience before St. Peter's throne. But the Normans were not caught unawares. In Melfi, the news of the papal host stirred both alarm and defiance. The Hauteville brothers, now William Iron Arm's successors, Humphrey and Robert Guiscard, recognized the danger of underestimating the Pope's moral and political weight. A battle against Lombards or Byzantines was one thing. To take the field against the Pope himself risked eternal damnation in the eyes of Christendom. Yet they also knew retreat would be the end of their authority. A ruler who yielded his ground to papal pressure would invite every rival to test him. And so they resolved not to hide behind walls but to meet the Pope's army in open battle. The two forces converged near the town of Civitate, on the banks of the Fortore River. The summer sun burned down on the dry hills as banners were raised and horns called men to formation. From one ridge, the papal host glittered, a disciplined line of German infantry in the center, their long pikes bristling, Lombard cavalry on the flanks, and priests moving among the ranks, lifting crucifixes to bless the coming charge. Across the field, the Normans assembled in 3 divisions. On the right, Count Richard of Aversa led his cavalry, their mail gleaming in the sun. On the left, Robert Guiscard commanded his contingent, restless and eager for the fray. At the center, Humphrey Hauteville stood with the main Norman force, veterans of Apulia, riders who had smashed Byzantine cataphracts and stormed Calabrian strongholds. The battle began with movement on the Norman right. Richard's cavalry swept forward, their lances couched, aiming to shatter the Lombard allies of the papal army. The Lombards, seeing their Norman countrymen thundering down upon them, hesitated. Some fought. Others wheeled away, unwilling to die for a pope who might, tomorrow, be negotiating with the very men they faced. The Norman right collapsed the Lombard flank in minutes. On the other side of the field, Robert Guiscard's charge struck the German infantry. And here, the story was different. The Swabians stood like a wall of iron, their pikes leveled, their shields locked. Horses reared and fell, lances splintered, and the Norman riders wheeled back, regrouping. Twice more Guiscard led the charge, and twice the Germans held, their discipline unbroken. At the center, Humphrey watched the rhythm of the battle. He saw the papal flanks weakening even as the core of the army, the Germans, stood immovable. Slowly he began to contract his lines, drawing the Germans forward, away from their support. Then, at his signal, Richard and Robert wheeled in from either side, enclosing the German bloc in a tightening ring of steel. What followed was brutal. The Swabians fought like men who knew retreat meant death, each step backward paid for in Norman blood. But surrounded and pressed from all sides, they could not hold forever. One by one, their banners went down, their commanders fell, and their line broke under the relentless hammering of Norman lances and swords. The field fell silent, except for the cries of the wounded and the cawing of circling crows. Civitate was the Pope's defeat. Pope Leo IX, who had watched the battle from a nearby hill, now found himself a prisoner of the very men he had come to destroy. Yet the Normans treated him with a respect that was as calculated as it was genuine. They knew that killing or humiliating the Pope would turn Christendom against them. Instead, they escorted him to Benevento, keeping him in honorable custody for 9 months. During that time, the Normans pressed their advantage in negotiation. Leo, with little choice, formally recognized their holdings in Apulia and Calabria. It was not just a political victory. It was a sanctification of their rule. By the time the Pope was released in 1054, the Normans were no longer merely tolerated in southern Italy. They were legitimized by the very authority that had sought to erase them. The irony was not lost on them. They had fought the Vicar of Christ, won, and emerged not as excommunicated outlaws, but as papally endorsed lords. In the halls of Melfi, they toasted the victory with the same fervor as any conquest. In their minds, Civitate proved there was no force, not Byzantine, not Lombard, not even Rome itself, that could deny them their destiny. But destiny had more in store. With the Pope's recognition secured, the Normans could now turn their gaze fully to the sea, to the island that had haunted their ambitions for years. Sicily, fractured and weakened, awaited, and the men who had humbled the Pope were not the sort to leave a prize unclaimed. Fresh from humbling the Pope at Civitate, the Normans wasted no time turning that hard-won legitimacy into action, sweeping south to tighten their grip on the rest of the peninsula. Expansion. Across the southern peninsula. The smoke of Civitate had barely faded when the Normans turned their eyes back to the horizon. Victory over the Pope was not the end. It was the unsealing of a door. Beyond it lay the rest of southern Italy, a land still fractured, still divided, still vulnerable to the men who could strike fastest and hold longest. In Apulia, their grip tightened. Norman riders became a constant presence on the roads, their banners snapping in the wind over every hill, fort, and market square. Lombard lords who had once spoken of alliance now swore oaths of vassalage, some out of loyalty, most out of necessity. The Byzantines, humiliated by Civitate's consequences, still clung to coastal enclaves, their garrisons supplied by ships from across the Adriatic. But those ships sailed into a narrowing noose. Robert Guiscard, now the dominant figure among the Hauteville brothers, understood the necessity of striking quickly before Constantinople could send a stronger hand to reclaim its crumbling provinces. His rise had been meteoric. Younger son of a minor Norman lord, once derided for his rough manners, now Count of Apulia and Calabria by papal and imperial recognition. But Guiscard's ambitions were larger than titles. He wanted the Byzantines gone, utterly and permanently, from the mainland. The campaign began with calculated precision. In 1060, Norman forces pushed into the last Byzantine-held pockets of Apulia, targeting strongholds that had defied them for years. The sieges were patient and merciless. At Brindisi, They choked the port until hunger and disease did the work their ladders could not. At Otranto, they cut the town off from its inland allies, using both sea and land forces to squeeze the defenders. Each victory tightened the Norman stranglehold on the heel of Italy. But the keystone of Byzantine resistance was Bari. Perched on the Adriatic coast, it was both fortress and lifeline, the seat of the imperial Catapan, governor, and the last true projection of Byzantine authority in the region. Its walls were thick, its garrison seasoned, and its harbor open to the imperial fleets. For the Normans, Bari was not just another conquest. It was the final statement that southern Italy belonged to them. The siege of Bari began in 1068. Guiscard encircled the city by land while Norman ships, commanded by his brother Roger, harried its sea approaches. It was a slow, grinding affair. The Byzantines fought with the desperation of men defending the last stone of an empire's Italian crown. They sent pleas for aid to Constantinople, and twice imperial fleets broke through the blockade with supplies. But the Normans adapted, building heavier ships, reinforcing their naval presence, and learning the rhythms of the relief attempts until they could anticipate and counter them. Inside the city, hunger gnawed. Grain prices soared, and famine stalked the streets. The once proud markets of Bari became grim exchanges of dwindling bread for jewels and heirlooms. Yet the defenders held out, trusting that relief must come, that the empire could not abandon them. But Constantinople's reach was long in memory, short in muscle. The empire was fighting on too many fronts, in the Balkans, in Asia Minor, and the resources needed to break Bari's siege never arrived. In April 1071, after nearly 3 years of resistance, Bari surrendered. The Byzantine Catapan boarded a ship and sailed east, carrying with him the last flicker of imperial rule in Italy. The purple banners of Constantinople were lowered from the walls, and the cross of the Normans rose in their place. For the first time in 5 centuries, no Byzantine soldier stood on the Italian mainland. The fall of Bari was more than a military triumph. It was a reshaping of the map and the balance of power. The Normans now commanded the entire southern peninsula, from the Garigliano River to the tip of Calabria. They controlled the ports, the roads, the fortresses. Trade that once flowed to Byzantine coffers now passed through Norman tolls. Robert Guiscard's court in Melfi swelled with new faces, Lombard nobles seeking favor, Greek merchants eager to keep their rights under new rulers, envoys from the papacy, and even representatives from the maritime republics of Amalfi, Pisa, and Genoa, who saw in the Normans both potential partners and dangerous rivals. Yet the conquest was not purely a matter of steel. Guiscard moved quickly to integrate his new territories. He allowed Greek communities to keep their Orthodox rights, understanding that religious tolerance, or at least pragmatism, would buy peace faster than forced conversion. He confirmed certain Lombard privileges while ensuring their military obligations to him were non-negotiable. Land was redistributed to his Norman captains, binding their loyalty to the soil they now defended. The Norman court began to take on the character of a Mediterranean power rather than a band of adventurers. It was not just the clang of weapons in the barracks, but the hum of scribes, the bustle of markets, the scent of spices brought by traders who knew that the roads were now safer under Norman watch than they had been in decades. But for all the consolidation, the Normans were restless. Conquest was their heartbeat, and the mainland, for all its riches, was not enough. From the coasts of Calabria, they could see across the Strait of Messina to Sicily, its mountains blue in the distance. The island had been under Muslim rule for a century and a half, a patchwork of emirates and rival warlords. To Guiscard and his brother Roger, Sicily was both opportunity and destiny, a jewel of fertile lands, rich ports, and strategic command of the central Mediterranean. The southern peninsula was theirs, but the game was not over. It had only changed boards. With Bari fallen, the Normans could now look beyond defending what they held to claiming what they desired. The fall of Byzantium's last fortress had given them more than land. It had given them freedom, the freedom to set their gaze anywhere the sea could carry them. And as the banners of Guiscard snapped in the wind over Bari's walls, the wind carried another scent: the spices, the silks, the wealth of the markets of Palermo and Syracuse. Sicily awaited, and so, with the mainland secured and Byzantium driven from Italy, the Normans' gaze settled on the blue silhouette across the strait, a prize long dreamed of and now finally within reach. The road to Sicily. From the shores of Calabria, Sicily lay like a mirage, close enough that on a clear day a man could see the sunlight glinting on its hills, yet far enough that the strait between might as well have been a moat around a fortress. For the Normans, who had risen from mercenaries to masters of the southern mainland, the island was not merely another conquest. It was the keystone to controlling the central Mediterranean, the bridge between Europe and Africa, a prize so rich it shimmered in their ambitions long before they had the means to take it. But Sicily, in the mid-11th century, was no unified realm. For more than 150 years, it had been under Muslim rule, first as part of the Aghlabid Emirate of North Africa, and later under the Kalbid dynasty. Now that dynasty was fracturing, torn apart by internal rivalries. The island was a patchwork of emirates: Palermo in the north, Syracuse in the southeast, Agrigento in the west, each ruled by its own warlord, each willing to betray the other for advantage. It was this division, as much as Norman courage, that made conquest possible. Robert Guiscard, Count of Apulia and Calabria, was already occupied with consolidating his power on the mainland and preparing for future campaigns in the Adriatic. But his younger brother, Roger, later to be called the Great Count, had the vision, the patience, and the appetite for the island across the strait. Where Guiscard saw Sicily as a strategic extension of his domain, Roger saw a stage on which he could build his own legacy. The first step was not an invasion, but an alliance. The Normans had learned from years of Italian politics that sometimes the surest path into a fortress was through its rival's gate. In 1060, Ibn al-Thumna, the emir of Catania, found himself locked in a vicious struggle against his Muslim rival Ibn al-Hawas, who held Palermo. Facing defeat, Ibn al-Thumna turned to the Normans, the very infidels his faith had taught him to despise, and offered them a bargain: aid in his war for Sicily in exchange for a foothold on the island. For Roger, it was the perfect opening. Not only would it give him a landing point, it would pit Norman steel against a divided enemy without uniting the whole island against them. Guiscard agreed, and the brothers began their preparations. In May 1061, the Normans crossed the Strait of Messina. Their fleet was small, their forces modest by the standards of great empires, but their discipline and leadership outweighed their numbers. At the head of the armada stood the Hauteville brothers, Guiscard with his seasoned warlords, Roger with his restless cavalry. The crossing was swift, the wind at their backs, and they landed at Messina before the defenders could organize a serious resistance. The fall of Messina was a shock to the island's rulers. The Normans moved quickly to fortify the port, turning it into a bridgehead from which they could launch deeper strikes. From there, the campaign unfolded like a tightening spiral. The brothers advanced cautiously, using both diplomacy and force, offering terms to those who would submit, burning the lands of those who resisted. Their early victories were as much psychological as military. Muslim garrisons accustomed to fighting other emirs now faced an enemy that would not be bought off or lured into truces that led nowhere. The Normans struck swiftly, withdrew before counterattacks could gather, and returned again when the defenders' guard was down. In 1071, with Bari fallen and the Byzantine threat erased from the mainland, Guiscard turned more of his attention to Sicily. Together, the brothers laid siege to Palermo, the richest and most populous city on the island. The siege was a masterpiece of coordination. Norman fleets blockading the harbor, cavalry raiding the surrounding countryside, siege engines hammering at the walls. Inside the city, the Muslim rulers faced the same dilemma that had doomed Bari. no allies willing or able to send sufficient relief. By January 1072, Palermo fell. Its mosques were not destroyed but converted into churches, a deliberate signal of Norman policy: conquer, but do not erase. They allowed Muslims to continue practicing their faith, taxed but protected, a calculated blend of pragmatism and domination that kept the conquered from rising en masse. The fall of Palermo gave the Normans the north coast, but the rest of the island remained contested. Roger took the lead in a long, grinding campaign, moving from stronghold to stronghold, often against enemies who were more willing to switch sides than to fight to the death. Some emirates submitted outright, their rulers content to keep their titles under Norman suzerainty. Others resisted fiercely. The final act came in 1091 with the fall of Noto, the last Muslim stronghold in the southeast. By then, Roger was master of the island in all but name. The conquest had taken 30 years, a generation of war, siege, and diplomacy. It was not a storming of walls in a single year, but the patient turning of a key in a lock that had rusted for decades. In the aftermath, Sicily became something rare in medieval Europe, a realm where Latin Christians, Greek Orthodox, and Muslims lived under a single ruler. The Normans encouraged trade across the Mediterranean, drawing merchants from North Africa, the Levant, and Italy. Palermo flourished as a cosmopolitan capital, its streets echoing with Arabic, Greek, and Latin in equal measure. The road to Sicily had been paved with opportunism, audacity, and an almost theatrical understanding of power. The Normans had not merely crossed the Strait of Messina. They had crossed into a new identity. No longer just conquerors of Italian provinces, they were now Mediterranean lords, heirs to the legacies of Rome, Byzantium, and the Caliphates. And as Roger rode through the streets of Palermo in triumph, the bells of the churches mingling with the call to prayer from the minarets, it was clear that this conquest was more than a victory of arms. It was the birth of a kingdom that would, for a shining moment in the 12th century, stand as one of the most remarkable realms in Europe. A realm born from the gamble of crossing a narrow strip of water and from the boldness to see beyond it. Yet even as Roger's triumph echoed through the streets of Palermo, another Hauteville gaze was already fixed far beyond the island. Robert Guiscard's eyes turning eastward toward the ancient empire across the Adriatic. Ambition in the Balkans. By the time the last Muslim stronghold in Sicily fell in 1091, Roger was secure in his island kingdom. But Robert Guiscard, the elder Hauteville, had never been content with borders that did not touch the horizon. The Mediterranean was his chessboard, and his eyes now turned east, beyond the familiar coasts of Italy, toward the ancient empire whose eagles still flew over Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, for all its gilded mosaics and imperial ceremony, was not at its strongest. In the late 1070s and early 1080s, it was a court of intrigue and shifting loyalties. Alexios Komnenos had seized the throne in 1081 in a swirl of palace coups, discontented generals, and civil unrest. The Seljuk Turks pressed from the east, the Pechenegs raided from the north, and in the Balkans, imperial authority was more a parchment decree than a military reality. To Robert, this weakness was opportunity. He had tested the Byzantines before in Italy, taking Bari from their grasp in 1071, and he knew the empire could be beaten. But now, with Sicily secure and his power base unchallenged, he could dream bigger. His ambitions found their spark in a political gift, the marriage of his daughter Helena to Constantine Ducas, the son of a former Byzantine emperor. When that union was dishonored by Alexios's rise, Robert claimed it as a personal insult and a righteous cause for war. War, for Robert Guiscard, was never merely about honor. It was about inheritance, and in his mind, the Byzantine Empire itself could be claimed through the rights of his daughter. Whether this was genuine belief or a pretext for conquest mattered little. The sails were already being cut, the forges were already hammering out spearheads, and the Normans of southern Italy, restless warriors never long at peace, smelled plunder in the east. In the summer of 1081, Robert assembled a fleet at Brindisi. It was an armada worthy of a conqueror. Dromons and galleys bristling with warriors, siege engines lashed to their decks, horses penned below. Among the captains was his son Bohemond, tall and sharp-featured, already marked by the restless energy that would one day lead him to the First Crusade. The wind was with them as they struck across the Adriatic, the blue water stretching like a stage curtain before the drama to come. Their target was Dyrrhachium, the great fortress city guarding the western entrance to the Via Egnatia, the ancient Roman road that led straight to the heart of the Balkans and, ultimately, to Constantinople. If Dyrrhachium fell, the way into Macedonia and Thrace would lie open. The landing was swift and brutal. Norman cavalry thundered down the beaches, scattering local defenders, while engineers began encircling the walls. Robert positioned siege towers and catapults, but the Byzantines, warned by their scouts, had fortified the city heavily. Behind those walls waited a garrison commanded by the veteran general George Palaiologos, a man as patient as Robert was relentless. The siege became a contest of endurance. The Normans hurled boulders and firepots. The Byzantines countered with Greek fire, that alchemical terror which clung to ships and men alike, burning even upon the sea. Supplies for the Normans came over the waves, but so too did their greatest threat. The Venetians, allies of Alexios and masters of the Adriatic, sailed into the conflict with sleek war galleys and crews drilled to perfection. The first great naval clash was a disaster for the Normans. Venetian rams punched through their hulls, boarding parties drove them from the decks, and within hours, the sea outside Dyrrhachium belonged to the enemy. Robert's blockade was broken, his supply lines endangered. Yet the Norman duke was not a man to retreat at the first blow. On land, Alexios himself marched to relieve the city, bringing with him the famed Varangian Guard, Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors wielding massive axes, their reputation as fearsome as any in Christendom. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the fate of Robert's Balkan gamble. On October 18, 1081, the two armies met outside Dyrrhachium. Robert arrayed his cavalry in disciplined ranks, their armor glinting beneath a pale autumn sun. Across the field, the Byzantines unfurled their standards, the double-headed eagle, the icons of saints, and the Varangians advanced like a living wall of steel. The opening clash was a storm of motion. Norman knights charging with lowered lances, Varangian axes rising and falling in deadly arcs, the earth shaking beneath the weight of men and horses. For a time, the Varangians held, their long-handled blades biting into man and mount alike. But Robert, seeing their advance overextend, ordered a feigned retreat. The Varangians, drunk on the scent of victory, followed, and the Norman wings wheeled in, surrounding them in a crushing counterattack. By nightfall, the field belonged to the Normans. Alexios retreated with the remnants of his army. Dyrrhachium remained encircled, and Robert stood at the threshold of the empire. It was his most brilliant victory. But even in triumph, the seeds of failure were sown. The Venetians still ruled the sea, and with it the flow of supplies. Disease began to stalk the Norman camp, and attrition wore down the army faster than any Byzantine sword. Over the winter, Robert pushed further inland, taking towns and fortresses, but the deeper he went, the thinner his lines stretched. In the spring of 1082, news came that would pull him from the Balkans altogether. Pope Gregory VII, his ally, was besieged in Rome by the forces of Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. To abandon the Pope would be to abandon the legitimacy Robert had so carefully built. Reluctantly, he began withdrawing his forces, leaving Bohemond to continue the fight. The road eastward had been opened, but the moment to seize it was lost. The Balkans would not fall to the Normans. Not yet. Still, the siege of Dyrrhachium and the battle that followed had burned Robert's name into the annals of the empire's enemies. He had crossed the Adriatic with the confidence of a king, fought the emperor himself, and stood victorious on the bloodied grass outside the city walls. And though the Normans withdrew, their shadow lingered over Constantinople, a reminder that in the new world of the 11th century, no empire, however ancient, was beyond the reach of a man bold enough to try. But while Robert's sails turned west toward Rome, the fire he had lit in the Balkans did not die. It burned on in the hands of his son, Bohemond, who now stepped from the shadow of his father into the uncertain light of command. Bohemond continues the campaign. 1082–1083. The Adriatic wind still carried the scent of smoke from Dyrrhachium when Robert Guiscard turned his sails westward. Rome called. Pope Gregory VII was hemmed in by the Holy Roman Emperor, and to ignore that plea would be to betray both ally and image. But the Norman hold on the Balkans could not simply be abandoned. Into that breach stepped Bohemond, Robert's son, tall as a spear, his hair the color of burnished copper, his eyes bright with the restless light of ambition. Bohemond had fought at Dyrrhachium and tasted the strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration that follows a great victory. Now, with his father gone, he carried not just the command of an army, but the weight of the Norman dream in the East. For him, this was not merely a campaign. It was a chance to carve his name into the stone of history beside the great conquerors. The Byzantines, under Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, were far from beaten. The loss at Dyrrhachium had been a wound, but not a mortal one. Alexios was no stranger to adversity. He had come to power in a world half on fire, and he meant to keep it from burning to ash. Where Robert had relied on the crushing weight of the Norman cavalry charge, Alexios turned to something older, subtler, the arts of patience, deception, and divide and rule. Through the winter of 1081 to 1082, Alexios rebuilt his armies, filling the ranks with seasoned soldiers from Asia Minor, loyal Tagmata troops from the capital, and mercenaries from as far afield as the steppes. He gathered intelligence on Norman movements, sent envoys to tempt their allies away, and waited for the moment when the Norman advance would overreach itself. Bohemond, eager to press the advantage, led his forces inland from Dyrrhachium along the ancient roads of Epirus. His banners snapped in the mountain winds, his columns of cavalry and infantry winding through valleys older than Rome itself. Town after town fell, Ioannina, Arta, their garrisons either surrendering outright or falling beneath the relentless rhythm of the Norman assault. But each mile forward drew him deeper into a land that Alexios knew better than any mapmaker. The emperor avoided open battle, refusing to offer the grand confrontation Bohemond sought. Instead, Byzantine forces shadowed the Norman columns, striking at supply lines, burning crops, and vanishing into the hills. Scouts returned with tales of phantom armies, there one day, gone the next. It was war not as the Normans loved it, but as the Byzantines excelled at it, a slow suffocation rather than a single killing blow. Alexios also worked his craft in diplomacy. Messengers found their way to the Lombard and Greek contingents within Bohemond's ranks, whispering promises of land, gold, or safety if they deserted. Some slipped away under cover of darkness. Others, their loyalty cracked by the constant hunger and the absence of decisive battle, surrendered entire outposts without a fight. The decisive moment came at Larissa in Thessaly. It was a city of strategic importance. Its capture would open the road to central Greece, threatening the Byzantine heartlands from the south. Bohemond laid siege in early spring 1083, encircling the walls with wooden palisades and siege engines, confident that the city would fall as so many others had. But Alexios had prepared the ground. Byzantine forces harassed the Norman perimeter day and night, forcing Bohemond to spread his troops thin. Supplies dwindled. The promised reinforcements from Italy never arrived in the numbers he needed. Then came the trap. Alexios feigned a retreat toward the plains, luring part of the Norman force into pursuit. The Byzantines turned suddenly, their cavalry slamming into the isolated Normans, while archers rained arrows from the flanks. It was not a slaughter. Bohemond's men fought hard to break free, but it was a wound to both his army and his pride. The Byzantines reoccupied ground he had taken, and the siege of Larissa began to unravel. Disease crept through the Norman camp. Desertions increased. By summer, the reality was clear. The campaign had lost its momentum, and to stay meant destruction. Bohemond withdrew to the coast, his banners still flying but his ambitions checked. The Balkans, so close in his father's dreams, slipped back into Byzantine hands. Dyrrhachium remained the farthest Norman foothold, and even that was precarious. Yet the retreat did not break him. Bohemond had seen the mettle of Alexios Komnenos, learned the taste of Byzantine cunning, and felt the sting of his own limitations. These lessons would follow him in the years ahead, to Italy, to Antioch, to the heart of the First Crusade, where the dance between Norman daring and imperial guile would play out again on another stage. For now, the Adriatic winds carried him home, his ships heavy with the weary but unbroken remnant of the army. Behind him, the Balkans settled into the uneasy rhythm of Byzantine survival, their towns and roads once more under the shadow of the double-headed eagle. And yet, in the chronicles of both East and West, the name Bohemond began to gather a certain gravity, a promise that this was not the last the world would hear of the copper-haired son of Robert Guiscard, the man who had dared to challenge the empire and lived to try again. Yet even as Bohemond's ships turned homeward from the weary shores of the Balkans, another crisis was already rising in the west, one that would draw Robert Guiscard himself back into the heart of Christendom, to the smoldering streets of Rome. Intervention in Rome, 1084. When Robert Guiscard returned from the Balkans in the spring of 1084, he carried the dust of foreign roads on his cloak and the memory of victories and unfinished wars in his mind. The Adriatic adventure had not ended as he dreamed, but there was no time for reflection. Rome was calling, and this time, the stakes were not an emperor's insult or a foreign stronghold, but the survival of the papacy itself. Pope Gregory VII, the fiery reformer who had defied kings and emperors alike, was trapped within the Leonine city. The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, had marched south in fury after being excommunicated, laying siege to the Pope's stronghold and installing his own puppet, the anti-pope Clement III. The streets of Rome were choked with imperial troops, their banners fluttering beside the ancient ruins as if they were the rightful heirs to the Caesars. For Robert, this was more than an opportunity. It was obligation. Gregory had recognized and blessed Norman power in southern Italy. In return, Robert had sworn to defend him. That vow now demanded steel and fire. The Norman Duke marched north from Apulia at the head of an army hardened by the wars of Sicily and the Balkans. Riders went ahead to spread the word. The Guiscard was coming. In the villages along the road to Rome, shutters closed at the sound of his name. For even those who welcomed his arrival knew the Normans brought not only salvation, but also the shadow of destruction. By May, his vanguard reached the outskirts of the city. Henry IV, hearing of Robert's approach, weighed his chances. His forces had been campaigning for months, supplies were running thin, and he had no desire to be caught between Norman cavalry and the fortified walls of Rome. The emperor withdrew northward, taking Clement III with him. It was a retreat in good order, but a retreat nonetheless. Robert entered Rome not as a cautious liberator, but as a conqueror who understood that in war, mercy was often an afterthought. He met Gregory in the Lateran, the Pope's face gaunt but unbowed. Their greeting was formal, but beneath it ran the current of shared purpose. The emperor had been driven off, the papal authority restored, for now. But Rome was not at peace. Many of its citizens, weary of Gregory's conflicts and resentful of Norman influence, looked upon Robert's army as an occupying force. Whispers turned to shouts in the narrow streets, and soon mobs gathered, throwing stones at Norman patrols. The tension ignited into open revolt. Robert, ever decisive, crushed the uprising with the same ferocity he would bring to a battlefield. Norman troops swept through the streets, their swords flashing in the smoky light. Fires broke out, whether by accident or intent, no one could say, and the dry air of early summer turned them into an inferno. The flames leapt from house to house, curling around ancient temples and Christian basilicas alike, casting an orange glow over the city that had once been the heart of the world. By nightfall, much of Rome lay in chaos. The revolt was broken, but so too was any illusion of Norman restraint. Citizens fled across the Tiber or into the countryside, carrying with them tales of massacre and ruin. Gregory VII, though rescued, now found himself in a city emptied of friends and filled with smoke. It was a bitter salvation. In the eyes of history, Robert had kept his oath to the Pope, but at the price of turning the eternal city into a place of mourning. The sack of Rome in 1084 would stain his name as deeply as any victory would gild it. Gregory, unwilling to remain in a city so hostile, departed with Robert for the safety of Norman-held Salerno. There, in exile, the Pope would live out his final years, still unbent in spirit but far from the seat of St. Peter. For Robert Guiscard, the campaign was both triumph and warning. He had humbled an emperor, rescued the head of the church, and shown that Norman power could reach the heart of Christendom itself. Yet the smoldering ruins of Rome were a reminder that even victories could poison the ground from which they sprang. That summer, as the Mediterranean winds shifted toward autumn, Robert began planning his return to the east. The Byzantines still held lands he desired, and the road to Constantinople, though blocked, was not forgotten. But fate would not grant him the time. In July 1085, before his fleet could sail, the Guiscard fell ill, fever gripping him in the heat of Kephallonia. Within weeks, the conqueror was gone. He left behind an unfinished empire, lands stretching from Apulia to Sicily, the memory of battles fought in Illyria and Epirus, and a legacy of ambition that would burn in the hearts of his sons. And in Rome, among the charred stones and rebuilt streets, the echo of 1084 lingered, a year when salvation had come in the form of fire. Yet the death of Robert Guiscard did not mark the end of the Norman story in the south. In the turbulent decades that followed, amid rivalries and shifting alliances, a new figure would rise, one who would forge not just conquests, but a kingdom. Roger II, the empire builder, 1130 to 1154. The Norman adventure in the Mediterranean might have ended with the death of Robert Guiscard, his sons squabbling over the inheritance, and the ambitions of their line dissolving like mist over the Adriatic. But history rarely closes its doors so neatly. Out of the ashes of succession disputes and fractured alliances, there emerged a man who would not only restore the Norman dream, but raise it to heights his forebears had never dared to imagine. His name was Roger II, tall, commanding, with eyes that seemed to measure the worth of a man before he spoke a word. Born in Sicily in 1095, the youngest son of Roger I, he grew not among the cold stone halls of Normandy, but beneath the Mediterranean sun, in a land where Greek merchants haggled in the markets, Arabic scholars debated in the courts, and Latin knights patrolled the coasts. From the beginning, Roger's world was not a single culture but a mosaic. By 1127, fate placed in his hands both the county of Sicily, inherited from his father, and the mainland duchies of Apulia and Calabria, fallen to him through the death of Duke William II, without an heir. It was a moment that might have fractured under lesser leadership, for barons in both Sicily and Italy eyed their new master with suspicion. But Roger moved swiftly, using marriage alliances, gold, and, when persuasion failed, the mailed fist of Norman cavalry to bind his realms together. In 1130, his ambition took its boldest shape. The papacy was divided, Pope Innocent II on one side, the anti-pope Anacletus on the other, the see. Roger threw his weight behind Anacletus, not out of piety but out of opportunity. In exchange for his support, the antipope crowned him king of Sicily, not merely count or duke, but sovereign ruler of a unified realm stretching from the volcanic peaks of Etna to the limestone fortresses of Apulia. The coronation in Palermo was a spectacle worthy of the title. The great cathedral blazed with candlelight, the air heavy with incense. Latin priests chanted alongside Greek deacons, and Arabic-speaking officials stood among the royal guard. Roger, robed in silks embroidered with gold thread in the Fatimid style, placed on his head a crown whose design fused Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic artistry. In that moment, he was not merely a king, he was the embodiment of Sicily itself, a crossroads of the world. But a crown won through a schism was a crown contested. Innocent II denounced Roger's kingship and marched south with the support of the German Emperor Lothair III. The confrontation came in 1137, when imperial and papal forces swept through Apulia. Roger, ever the strategist, avoided open battle, retreating into the strongholds of the interior while his enemies overextended themselves. When Lothair died the next year, the invasion crumbled. By 1139, Pope Innocent II had no choice but to recognize Roger as king in the Treaty of Mignano, a formal seal on what had already become reality. From his capital in Palermo, Roger built more than castles and armies. He built a state. His court became a place where cultures mingled without fear. Greek remained a language of administration. Arabic scribes kept meticulous tax records, and Latin law coexisted with Byzantine codes. In the royal palace, mosaics glittered in gold and lapis, depicting not only Christian saints, but geometric patterns drawn from Islamic art. Under Roger's rule, trade flourished. The harbors of Messina and Palermo filled with ships from Alexandria, Tunis, Genoa, and Constantinople. Spices, silks, and silver flowed into the kingdom, and with them came knowledge. Mathematicians from North Africa worked alongside Sicilian scholars. Physicians translated ancient Greek texts into Latin. And in the 1150s, the geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi created the Tabula Rogeriana, a map of the known world so precise it would remain a standard for centuries. Roger understood that power in the Mediterranean was measured not just in walls and swords, but in fleets. He expanded Sicily's navy into a force capable of striking at any coast from the Aegean to the Atlantic. In 1146, he turned that navy toward North Africa, capturing ports and fortresses along the Ifriqiyan coast. Mahdia, Tripoli, and Sfax fell under his banner, and for a brief, brilliant moment, the Kingdom of Sicily became a Mediterranean empire, its domains stretching across 2 continents. Yet Roger's greatness lay not merely in conquest, but in his ability to hold together a kingdom of staggering diversity. Latin crusaders, Greek priests, Arab merchants, and Berber soldiers all served under the same crown. Where others might have imposed uniformity, Roger saw strength in plurality, so long as every subject, whatever their tongue or faith, recognized the authority of the king. In the twilight of his reign, Roger walked through the gardens of Palermo, where orange trees scented the air and fountains whispered in Arabic script carved centuries before. He had weathered invasions, rebellions, and the constant shifting of alliances, yet his kingdom stood whole, richer, stronger, and more splendid than the one he had inherited. When he died in 1154, the bells of Palermo rang for a man who had not merely worn a crown, but had reshaped the very idea of kingship in the Mediterranean. The chroniclers of his time called him a ruler without equal in the world. And for once, it was no idle flattery. Roger II left behind a legacy of ambition tempered by vision, a realm where cultures met not only in conflict, but in creation. His heirs would struggle to keep it, as all heirs do. But for nearly a quarter of a century, the Kingdom of Sicily had been the center of a world, and at its heart stood a man who had turned the Norman sword into a builder's tool. Yet even at the height of his triumph in Sicily, Roger's gaze was never confined to the island's shores. The restless ambition that had built a kingdom now sought to cast its shadow across the sea. Expansion into North Africa, 1135 to 1148. For most rulers, the glittering crown of Sicily, Calabria, and Apulia would have been prize enough. But Roger II was not most rulers. He looked beyond the narrow seas and imagined an empire that stretched like a net across the heart of the Mediterranean. His gaze fell naturally to the south, to the coast of Ifriqiya, the rich lands of present-day Tunisia and parts of Libya, once Roman provinces, now Muslim-ruled for centuries. These shores had been part of the Norman imagination since the days when Robert Guiscard's fleets raided far-off coasts for plunder. But for Roger, this was not about pillage. It was about control. Over trade routes, over grain supplies, over the very currents of the Mediterranean. Whoever ruled both Sicily and the North African coast could command the sea itself. The opportunity came in the 1130s, when the Zirid dynasty, long the rulers of Ifriqiya, fell into disarray. Weakened by tribal revolts and the encroaching power of the Almoravids in the west, the Zirids could no longer hold their ports with the same iron grip. Pirates roamed the waters between Africa and Sicily, preying on merchant vessels. Roger presented himself as both avenger and protector, but his protection came at the point of a spear. In 1135, Norman sails appeared on the horizon off Jerba. The landing was swift, the resistance scattered. The Normans, with their chain-mailed cavalry and disciplined infantry, were a shock to the lightly armed defenders. The island fell within days, giving Roger a forward base from which to strike deeper into Africa. From there, the campaigns moved with relentless rhythm. Tripoli, a city of ancient Roman walls and bustling markets, fell under Norman banners in 1146. Then came Sfax, its defenders overwhelmed after fierce street fighting, and finally, in 1148, the jewel of the coast, Mahdia. Its crescent harbor, once a base for Zirid fleets, now flew the gold and red flag of Sicily. The fall of Mahdia marked the collapse of Zirid authority in Ifriqiya. In these newly conquered lands, Roger showed the same political genius he had in Sicily. He did not attempt to force mass conversion or erase existing governance. Instead, he ruled indirectly, allowing Arab and Berber elites to administer their cities under Norman oversight. Taxes were collected for Palermo, and Norman garrisons ensured loyalty, but the day-to-day rhythms of life remained much as they had before. To the merchants of Genoa and Pisa, the change of rulers meant safe harbors and fewer pirate raids. To the scholars of Mahdia, it meant access to Sicilian patronage and the great court of Palermo. And to Roger, it meant that the map of his realm now spanned 2 continents, a feat no other Christian ruler in the Mediterranean could match. But the conquest of Ifriqiya was not merely about territory, it was also about prestige. The sight of Norman banners in Africa shocked the courts of Europe and the Muslim world alike. Chroniclers in Constantinople marveled at the audacity. In Marrakesh and Cairo, rulers weighed how to respond to this new power rising in the Middle Sea. Roger, ever the master of image, had coins struck bearing his titles in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, as if to proclaim that his kingship transcended language and faith. Yet for all its glory, the African empire was built on fragile foundations. Norman supply lines stretched across the sea, vulnerable to storms and hostile fleets. The Almohad movement, rising in the Maghreb, would soon turn its eyes eastward, and in Sicily itself, the delicate balance of Latin, Greek, and Muslim communities was beginning to strain under the pressures of war and taxation. For now, though, Roger basked in the height of his power. In Palermo, he received envoys from Spain, the Levant, and the Byzantine Empire, all eager to court his favor. The royal palace became a theater of splendor. Halls lined with mosaics, courtyards perfumed with citrus blossoms, and gardens where fountains murmured beside marble lions. In the map room, Muhammad al-Idrisi worked tirelessly on the Tabula Rogeriana, charting the very lands Roger now ruled. In the summer of 1149, Roger stood on the walls of Mahdia, watching the sun sink into the sea. The harbor below teemed with ships, Sicilian war galleys, merchant cogs from Italy, and dhows from the Red Sea. This was the empire he had imagined, a realm where the flow of goods, ideas, and power met under his hand. But the Mediterranean was never a still sea. Even as the king gazed upon his African prize, the tides of fortune were shifting. In the west, the Almohads gathered strength. In the east, Byzantine diplomats whispered of reclaiming lost lands. And in Rome, the papacy still eyed the Norman kingdom with suspicion. Roger could not know that within a generation, the North African territories would be lost, swept away by forces even his genius could not contain. For now, the dream held, and the kingdom of Sicily stood as the mightiest power in the central Mediterranean, its crown gleaming with the light of two continents, and at its center, the man who had forged it all, whose ambition had leapt the sea, walked the marble halls of Palermo knowing he had achieved what no Norman before him had dared. He had turned a warrior people into the masters of an empire. But no empire, however dazzling, stands untouched by time. As the waves that had carried Norman banners to Africa began to turn, the crown of Sicily passed to hands far less certain than Roger's. William Wharton II, Crisis and End, 1154-1194. When Roger II died in 1154, the kingdom of Sicily was a marvel of the medieval world, a tapestry of cultures, a maritime empire that straddled continents. Yet empires are most fragile at their zenith, and the crown passed not to a seasoned conqueror, but to his son William I, a man history would call the Bad. William was not without intelligence, but he lacked his father's restless energy. Where Roger had paced the halls of Palermo like a commander in a tent, William moved as if the crown were a burden. The courtiers whispered that he preferred hunting in the citrus groves to attending councils, that he listened more to his favorites than to his generals. In a kingdom that thrived on momentum, he seemed a ruler of pause. The first shock came from across the sea. In 1158, the rising power of the Almohads swept into Ifriqiya. The Norman garrisons, thinly spread and isolated, were no match for the wave that broke upon them. One by one, Roger's African conquests, Jerba, Sfax, Mahdia, were lost. Within 2 years, the dream of a two-continent empire lay in ruins, reduced to memories and scattered coins bearing Roger's titles. In Sicily itself, the balance Roger had so carefully maintained began to fray. Latin officials grew resentful of Greek and Muslim administrators who still held key positions. The Muslim population, once protected, now faced increased taxation and suspicion. A revolt erupted in 1160, led by disaffected nobles and fueled by discontent among the people. The conspirators struck deep into the royal household, assassinating the king's powerful minister, Maio of Bari, in the streets of Palermo. For a moment, it seemed the Norman kingdom might collapse into civil war, but William proved more resilient than his enemies had imagined. In a rare flash of resolve, he crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, burning the estates of rebellious barons, hanging ringleaders, and reasserting royal control. It was a victory that secured his throne but deepened his reputation for cruelty. If his father had ruled with both velvet glove and iron fist, William's grip was all iron. When William I died in 1166, the crown passed to his young son, William II, later known as the Good. The boy king grew into a man of charm and diplomacy, a stark contrast to his father. Where William they had ruled with suspicion, William II cultivated alliances. His reign saw peace with the papacy, improved relations with the Byzantine Empire, and a revival of trade in Sicilian ports. Palermo once again hummed with merchants from Alexandria, Venice, and Constantinople. Yet beneath the surface, the kingdom's foundations had shifted. The loss of North Africa meant Sicily no longer controlled the southern trade routes. The great fleet Roger II had built was still formidable, but it now guarded a smaller stage. William II's focus turned northward, toward Italy and the Holy Land. In 1177, he sealed a major diplomatic triumph by marrying Joanna of England, daughter of King Henry II and sister of Richard the Lionheart. The match bound Sicily to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Chroniclers celebrated the wedding as a sign that Sicily remained a kingdom of consequence, able to stand alongside the Capetians, Plantagenets, and Hohenstaufens. But in the shadows of the royal court, decisions were being made that would determine the kingdom's fate. William II had no children. Whether from piety, trust, or political miscalculation, he named as his heir Constance, his aunt, a woman long kept in a convent, and married her to Henry VI, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It was a union that might have seemed a safeguard, binding Sicily to imperial power. In truth, it was an invitation for the German eagle to swoop south. When William II died in 1189, the reaction across the kingdom was one of genuine mourning. He had been a generous ruler, a lover of peace, a patron of the arts. But he had left no direct heir, and his chosen succession was deeply unpopular among the Norman barons, who feared the loss of their autonomy under a German emperor. The vacuum of power was filled not by Constance and Henry, but by Tancred of Lecce, an illegitimate grandson of Roger II. Small in stature but fierce in ambition, Tancred seized the crown with the backing of many nobles. For a few years, he held off the imperial claim, even fending off an invasion by Henry VI. But Tancred's sudden death in 1194, followed swiftly by the death of his young son, left the throne undefended. Henry VI moved swiftly, marching into Sicily with his army. Palermo, unable to resist, opened its gates. On Christmas Day, 1194, in the very city where Roger II had been crowned, Henry was crowned King of Sicily. The Norman dynasty, which had risen from Viking raiders to Mediterranean kings, was finished. The fall was as swift as the rise had been relentless. Within a single lifetime, the empire Roger II had built was dismantled. Africa gone, the Norman court dissolved, its languages and traditions absorbed into the machinery of the Holy Roman Empire. The fusion of cultures that had defined Sicily did not vanish overnight, but without Norman kingship, its days of political unity were over. Yet even in defeat, the legacy endured. The mosaics of Monreale still shone with gold, the streets of Palermo still carried the scent of oranges and spice, and the memory of a kingdom where Latin knights, Greek priests, and Muslim scholars had served under one crown lingered in the minds of chroniclers. History would remember William III as the king who lost an empire, and William II as the king who kept peace, but signed away his people's independence. But together, their reigns formed the last act of the Norman story in Sicily, a tale that began with the long ships of Viking adventurers and ended beneath the shadow of the imperial eagle. But no empire, however radiant, can hold back the turning tide forever. As Roger's gaze faded from the throne, the crown passed into hands less certain, and the currents that had once carried Norman power outward began to pull it back toward its shores. Legacy. The Norman crown was gone, its last bearer buried under foreign banners, but the echo of their rule did not fade with the turning of the century. In the markets of Palermo, in the stones of cathedrals, in the law codes still quoted by judges, the Normans lived on, ghosts woven into the very fabric of southern Italy. To understand their legacy, one must begin with the architecture. Walk through the cloisters of Monreale, or stand beneath the golden vaults of the Palatine Chapel, and you will see more than art. You will see a political statement in stone and glass. Mosaics of Byzantine saints gaze down beside Arabic inscriptions. Norman kings sit enthroned in garments patterned like the robes of Fatimid caliphs. These were not mere aesthetic choices. They were the visual proof of a kingdom that had bound three civilizations, Latin, Greek, and Islamic, into a single, if fragile, harmony. The Normans left their mark, too, in the laws. Roger II's legal reforms, codified in the Assizes of Ariano, continued to shape governance long after the dynasty's fall. They were laws that balanced royal authority with practical administration, drawing from Roman tradition, Lombard custom, and Arab precedent. Under Norman rule, justice was not simply a feudal privilege. It became a centralized power of the crown, a concept that would influence later rulers of the region. In the countryside, their legacy lived in fortresses and towns. The square keeps they built, stark, commanding, often perched on hilltops, became enduring features of the landscape. Many were still in use centuries later, their walls absorbing the sunlight of each passing age, their gates opening to soldiers who spoke new languages but walked the same worn stone. The cultural synthesis of Norman Sicily was perhaps their most enduring gift. In an age when crusades raged and religious divides often meant bloodshed, the Normans had presided over a court where Muslim astronomers charted the stars for Christian kings, where Greek clerics copied manuscripts for Latin patrons, and where Arab poets recited verses to Norman knights. It was not a utopia. Tensions simmered and sometimes erupted, but it was a model of coexistence rare in medieval Europe. Even after the Latinization of the 13th century, traces of this pluralism lingered. Sicilian dialect retained Arabic words. Local cuisine kept flavors born in North Africa. Place names whispered of a time when muezzins called the faithful to prayer from towers now topped with crosses. The Normans' military legacy was no less significant. They had shown that a small but disciplined force, guided by ambitious leadership and unbound by the politics of a single land, could carve out an empire from the fractures of older powers. From the Viking fjords to the fields of Apulia, their story became a legend told in courts and taverns. The tale of men who began as mercenaries and ended as kings. But perhaps the greatest mark they left was psychological. The idea that Sicily was not merely a periphery, a distant outpost of Europe or a frontier of Islam, but a center in its own right. Under the Normans, Palermo had been a capital that looked both east and west, a hub through which the currents of the Mediterranean passed. That self-image once kindled would never fully die. In time, the island would pass through many hands: Hohenstaufen emperors, Angevin kings, Aragonese rulers, each layering their own ambitions atop the Norman foundation. Yet none could erase what had been achieved between the arrival of the first Norman knights and the fall of their last king. Centuries later, travelers from the north would still marvel at the mosaics, still taste the mingling of spices in the markets, still hear the stories of Robert Guiscard, Roger I, Roger II, and the long line of lords who had come from a distant, cold land to rule in the sun. The Normans themselves might have recognized the irony, that their political power had been as brief as it was brilliant, but their cultural legacy had endured far beyond the reach of their swords. Like the sea they once mastered, their influence ebbed and flowed, but it never truly vanished. And so, in the grand sweep of history, the Norman kingdom of Sicily stands as both a warning and an inspiration, proof that the audacity of a few can remake the world, and that the blending of peoples can create a beauty as lasting as stone, as fleeting as the wind over the Mediterranean. The last chapter of their reign may have ended in 1194, under the shadow of the imperial eagle, but the story the Normans wrote in southern Italy was not erased. It remains, etched in marble and memory, waiting for those who walk the old streets to look up at the mosaics and remember. Once, in this place, the sons of the north ruled the heart of the south.